Hello, limnologists. My name is Jake van der Zanden. I will be talking about all things benthic during my lecture. My hope is to give you a feel for several aspects of the benthic or bottom habitats and their role in lake ecosystems. I'll just note here that there's an optional reading that goes with this lecture, which is shown here. This reading will cover many of the topics that we discussed during this lecture, and it would be helpful to have a look at this reading if you are interested in learning more. So here is a brief outline of today's lecture. I'll start by going over and reviewing lake habitats and terms. We'll discuss the difference between littoral and profundal habitats. They're quite different. We'll discuss some of the main players of the zoobenthos in lakes. We'll discuss the functional feeding groups amongst the zoobenthos in lakes. We'll talk about biodiversity in the zoobenthos. And finally, we'll wrap up by talking about benthos and benthic habitats in a limnological context. We'll talk about the importance of benthos in energy flow in lake ecosystems, and we'll go over a case study of lake-to-land linkages. So let's start by briefly reviewing lake habitats. This is important background for our discussion of benthos. First, I'll mention the compensation depth. The compensation depth is the depth of light penetration in the water column. Below the compensation depth, it's basically dark, and above it, there is illumination. So you can see that in this cross-section of the lake. In the water that is shallower than compensation depth, there is light and hence photosynthesis. In the littoral zone, this means that light actually hits the bottom of the lake, and there can be primary production happening on the bottom. In contrast, in the profundal zone, there is minimal light that hits the bottom, and so hence photosynthesis on the bottom is minimal. So there are basically two habitats in lakes that have a benthic habitat: the littoral zone, where the benthic habitat is illuminated, and the profundal zone, where the benthic habitat is largely dark. It's also important to note that the profundal zone does have open water as well, and the profundal zone itself is overlaid by the open water zone. The open water zone is also called the pelagic zone, and note that the open water zone does not have any benthic habitats at all. So this lake habitat cross-section is a useful reference as you're thinking about the different types of benthic habitats in lakes. Going on to look at a lake from the top view, we see basically the same thing. The littoral zone is like a ring or a donut around the perimeter of the lake. This is usually the case because the shallower habitats are near the edges, and then the deeper habitats are out towards the middle. So out in the middle, we have the open water zone, and this open water zone overlays the profundal zone. So the littoral zone, we could think of it as a one-layer habitat, and then the open water zone and profundal zone comprise a two-layer habitat. Now let's go through some terms. First off is the term benthos. Benthos refers to association with the bottom habitat. It's a very broad term, and it doesn't specify what type of organisms we're dealing with. It just refers to the bottom. Next are terms that relate to plants in this bottom habitat. The first term is phytobenthos, and this refers to plants that are associated with the benthos. This is also often called attached algae, so you'll hear limnologists using phytobenthos or attached algae quite interchangeably, although attached algae is probably more commonly used. Another term that's related is periphyton. Periphyton refers to not only the attached algae, but also the fungi and the bacteria that are associated with bottom films that grow in the benthos. So periphyton is a little bit broader. It doesn't only refer to the attached algae, but also to other organisms in the biofilm. This diagram here in the bottom right shows different forms of attached algae, ranging from very low-lying forms. This would be something you might experience as sort of a slimy scum on surfaces, to larger filamentous forms on the right that can be very lush and provide large overgrowths. Another key player in these systems are macrophytes. Macrophytes are plants that grow in or near the water. It does not include the algae or the phytobenthos that we described before. These macrophytes occur in littoral zones, and they play a very important structural role in lake ecosystems, providing habitat and structure to many lakes. Again, only in the littoral zone. Macrophytes also provide habitat for epiphytes, which are algae that grow on top of the macrophytes. So just keep in mind that most macrophytes are covered with a layer of algae themselves, plants that grow on top of other plants. So to summarize, if we look at a lake ecosystem from the benthos perspective, we have two general benthic habitats. The littoral zone, which is illuminated and has algae growing in the bottom, and it hosts macrophytes, which themselves host epiphytes. And there's also the profundal zone, and the profundal zone tends to be dark. Now, let's talk about how profundal and littoral benthic habitats are different. First, let's talk about the habitat. The habitat itself in the profundal zone is quite homogeneous. It tends to be muddy, and there's not a tremendous amount of variability. Meanwhile, in the littoral zone, there is a tremendous amount of variability. The habitat includes lots of different features. You could have areas of sand or rock, fallen trees, macrophytes or aquatic plants like we discussed before. The habitat itself in the littoral zone tends to be highly patchy and heterogeneous. Next, let's compare the two in terms of oxygen. Profundal zone often has low concentrations of oxygen, particularly in stratified lakes. So this makes the profundal zone a harsh environment under certain situations, particularly in the summer when the lake is stratified. Meanwhile, in the littoral zone, oxygenation occurs because of the photosynthesis and exchange with the atmosphere. So the littoral zones tend to be highly oxygenated environments. Light. As we've already discussed, the profundal zone does not have a lot of light. It tends to be a dark place. Meanwhile, the littoral zone is illuminated. So there is light, and as a consequence, there is photosynthesis. In terms of food resources, the profundal zone does not have much to offer. Remember, it's a homogeneous environment, often without a lot of oxygen, not a lot of light either. A key food resource in the profundal zone is dead phytoplankton that rain out from above. So it is important to note that the profundal benthos do have this rain of phytoplankton cells falling down from above. The littoral zone, on the other hand, is a place that has diverse food resources, and there are lots of feeding opportunities, lots of different things to feed on. In terms of species diversity, perhaps it's not surprising to learn that the profundal zone generally does not have a tremendous amount of diversity. Very few species are adapted to survive in the harsh, dark, sometimes low oxygen environment that the profundal zone offers. On the other hand, the diverse habitats of the littoral zone and the hospitable conditions generally result in there being a lot more species diversity in the littoral zone. It is actually a very, very diverse habitat in lakes. And finally, a few comments on the strength of biotic interactions. In the profundal zone, biotic interactions like predation and competition tend to be weak. There simply are not a lot of species, and it's so harsh that there are not a lot of predator-prey interactions. Species tend to be limited by the harshness of the environment. Meanwhile, in the littoral zone, we tend to see stronger predation and competition. In other words, more intense biotic interactions. Next, I'd like to say a little bit about the main players in benthic habitats. It's important to note that there is a remarkable diversity of animals that inhabit the benthos of lakes. In fact, there are 12 phyla that are represented in these environments. These include taxa that we normally don't associate with lakes, such as freshwater sponges, hydroids, flatworms, tubificid worms, and leeches, snails, and different types of mussels. So we'll go through and talk about just a handful of the main groups of animals that inhabit the benthos. First, I'd like to talk about the crustaceans. Crustaceans can play a very, very important role in lake ecosystems. One group of organisms are the crayfishes, which can be dominant players in lake ecosystems. Now in Wisconsin, there are only about 7 species of crayfishes, but there are several hundred in North America. North America is a hotspot for crayfish diversity. There are other benthic crustaceans as well, such as the water louse here, also known as an isopod, and the freshwater shrimp, also known as an amphipod. These are not particularly diverse, but they play very important roles in lakes. I also like to note that a lot of the taxa that are associated with the zooplankton also do sometimes have links to the zoobenthos as well. Organisms such as copepods and cladocerans sometimes do have strong connections to the benthos. Next, I'll talk about aquatic insects. Aquatic insects are incredibly diverse, with about 45,000 species of aquatic insects occurring worldwide. Aquatic insects include taxa such as mayflies, damselflies, dragonflies, alderflies, and caddisflies. The unique thing about aquatic insects is their life histories. Generally, the life histories involve the juvenile stage being aquatic in nature, so the young live in the lakes. And then as they go into their adult stage, they go to terrestrial environments. So the life history of these organisms is such that they span the aquatic and the terrestrial environment. Again, they're very, very important, and they're very, very diverse in lakes in this area and around the world. Another group that I'd like to talk about are freshwater bryozoans. These are incredibly unique organisms. Most species of bryozoa are marine, but there is one class that is found exclusively in fresh water. Bryozoans, as you may know, are related to corals. What might seem to be an individual, like this brain-like object you see here, is actually a colony of individual organisms. This colony is about 1 foot in diameter and is highly gelatinous and slimy and firm to the touch. So when people find these in lakes, they are often shocked and do not know what they are. Here are some more photos of bryozoan colonies that are attached onto submerged branches in lakes. So these are things that you find fairly commonly in lakes in Wisconsin if you look carefully. Another interesting group that we can find in lakes are the cnidaria. Now, cnidaria include jellyfish and anemones. We generally think of these as marine organisms, but there are some freshwater representatives as well, including the hydra. So here on the bottom left is a picture of an individual hydra, and on the right is a picture of some zebra mussels from Lake Mendota with hydra on the habitat adjacent to the zebra mussels. So again, it's notable that these creatures live in lakes right here in Wisconsin. Finally, I want to say a few things about body size. Most studies on the zoobenthos focus on what we call the macrozoobenthos, those organisms that tend to be large, and specifically animals that come on a 500 micron sieve. The myobenthos and the microbenthos, the things that would go through a sieve of this size, tend to be very abundant and are comprised of diverse taxa, including rotifers, copepods, nematodes, small insects, protozoans. There is an incredible diversity of these organisms that are small and living in the benthos, but they're very rarely studied. It's not glamorous work. It's incredibly diverse. These organisms tend to be hard to identify. So it is notable that much emphasis has been on these larger organisms that live in the benthos, while the smaller organisms have been neglected and are not well understood. So far we've talked about the taxonomic groups, at least some of them that live in benthic habitats. I'd like to shift gears now and talk about something called functional feeding groups. Functional feeding groups are basically generalized feeding strategies or ways of going about making a living in one's environment. and they indicate something about the functional role of species in ecosystems. In benthic habitats, there are several generalized approaches to feeding. The first I'll talk about are deposit feeders and collectors. So these are benthic organisms that feed on materials or deposits in the bottom habitats, and they go about doing so as a way of getting food. A really good example of this are the larval stages of midges or lake flies. So this little red worm here is a chironomid larvae, and that insect that you see below it is the adult stage. So these organisms are classic deposit feeders. Another way of going about making a living is as a scraper. A classic example of a scraper is a snail. They feed upon algae on harder surfaces or any surface, and they do so by scraping the thin layer of algae off of these surfaces. An additional functional feeding group are shredders. A good example of shredders include caddisfly larvae, and shredders often will shred leaves that fall in from the surrounding watershed and derive their food from consuming those leaves. Another important functional feeding group are predators. So these are animals that feed on other organisms. A classic example of a benthic predator is a dragonfly larvae, and dragonfly larvae are well known for feeding on other zoobenthic animals. And finally are the filter feeders, the benthic filter feeders. A classic example of a benthic filter feeder is the zebra mussel, which is an invasive species. So they live in the benthos, but they consume food from the water column. They basically filter the water, removing particles from the water. So while they live in the benthos, their food is primarily derived from the actual water column. I'll say a little more about zebra mussels. Zebra mussels are an invasive species that has invaded aquatic ecosystems in North America somewhat recently, and they can have transformative effects on ecosystems. As we mentioned, they're a filter feeder. They feed on phytoplankton and particles in the water. They can become very abundant and often reduce phytoplankton biomass dramatically. The result is that they increase light penetration into the water column. They also release nutrients near the benthic substrate. So the question I have is, what might be the ecological consequences of this? Think about that for a minute. The consequences can be seen in this photo on the bottom. With an increase in light penetration into the water column and the release of nutrients near the benthic substrate, we often see excessive growth of benthic algae, or phytobenthos, in these conditions. So zebra mussel invasion often leads in a shift from phytoplankton dominance to benthic dominance. That's a pretty major shift in the structure of the ecosystem. So we've talked about the different taxonomic groups that are represented in the benthos, and we've talked about the different ways of making a living, the functional feeding groups in the zoobenthos. Diversity is really part of this, and it's the diversity of habitat types, diversity of resources, and the diversity of feeding strategies that allows niche partitioning among species that generally contributes to the diversity in an ecosystem. So the question I'll pose here is, how does animal diversity in the plankton and the benthos compare? To address this question, we'll look at Mirror Lake in New Hampshire, which is a very well-studied lake that has been subject to detailed studies both in the planktonic and the benthic habitats. So in Mirror Lake, there have been 29 zooplankton species that have been described. In contrast, a study by Strayer in 1985 described 322 animal species that are associated with the benthic habitats. Even this study wasn't able to do a complete count of zoobenthic species richness, but they estimated that the total species richness for zoobenthos would be somewhere on the order of 600 species. So that is a very impressive amount of diversity, and indicates that in this lake, the benthic habitats had about 20 times more species diversity than the planktonic habitats. I think this is pretty reflective of most lakes. It's just that most lakes don't have any people studying the zoobenthic diversity. Meanwhile, there's quite a bit more work done on planktonic diversity. So now let's talk about the role of benthos in energy flow in lake ecosystems. Now, energy flow is the concept of how primary production in ecosystems gets transferred up the food chain to higher consumers. The standard concept of lake ecosystems and food webs tend to be very pelagic dominated. This depiction you see on the right is very typical of how a limnologist might represent a food chain in a lake. You can see phytoplankton at the bottom of the food chain, and here there's large and small. Then there's zooplankton, and again you can see there's large zooplankton and small zooplankton. You see planktivorous invertebrates, you see small fish, and then you see large piscivorous fish. This is very common for limnologists to think about lakes in this way. And in fact, limnologists tend to ignore the zoobenthos in many occasions. This next figure shows how often benthic production and benthic processes are studied by limnologists. On the top figure is primary production. The middle figure is bacteria. And then the bottom one are invertebrates. What you see are three bars. On the left is pelagic. Then in the middle is benthic. And then on the right is both. And what you see is that on the top panel is that when studies are measuring primary production, almost always the measurements are done in the pelagic zone, and very few studies pay attention to the benthic habitats or pay attention to both. The same thing holds true for heterotrophic bacteria and for invertebrates. So the point here just is that when limnologists go out to take measurements, almost always focus on the pelagic or the open water habitats, not so much on the benthos. Now, when studies do pay attention to both and measure both benthic and pelagic primary production, it's notable that the benthic habitats often comprise a large fraction of whole lake primary production. The average was about 45%. So the point here is that benthic primary production can be a very important contributor to whole lake primary production, and it probably shouldn't be ignored. If we look at the ecosystem from another perspective, using fish as an indicator of what's important, fish diets reveal that a lot of the energy flow that moves through the ecosystem originates from the benthos. So about 60% of energy intake by fish comes from zoobenthos. Now, I will note that the benthic contribution to primary production and the benthic importance to fish varies a lot from lake to lake. So it's hard to generalize, but the main point here is that benthic primary production and benthic energy flow pathways supporting higher trophic levels are generally pretty important and shouldn't be ignored. So here we have a diagram that represents the traditional concept of lake food webs. It's rooted in the pelagic. You have phytoplankton, you have some zooplankton, some small fish, and some large fish. And here we have what I view as a more realistic picture of energy flow in lake food webs. You have pelagic energy flow, you have phytoplankton that supports zooplankton and small fish and large fish, but there's also an additional pathway originating in the benthos. You have periphyton or attached algae that supports benthic invertebrates. These benthic invertebrates are very important food items for fish, and then those fish in turn support larger fish. So in my view, this is a more realistic picture of energy flow pathways through food webs. So for the last part of this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about lake to land linkages, and this work does tie in very much to the benthos. This picture you see here is a picture of Lake Mývatn in Iceland. Lake Mývatn is a lake that is located in a remote part of Iceland. There's relatively little human impact on this ecosystem, and the ecosystem hasn't been heavily impacted by human activities. Lake Mývatn is somewhat famous because it has an incredibly high abundance of midge larvae living in the benthic habitats in the lake. So when midge larvae are at their peak, their density in the benthic habitats is around 100,000 individuals per meter squared. That is an incredibly high density of midge larvae. It's also notable that this lake is large. It's about 30 square kilometers. So when you do the math and you look at the emergence of insects, it ends up being a tremendous mass of material coming out of the lakes. Calculations have estimated that about 800,000 kilograms dry weight of midges emerge from this lake every year. And it looks like this. These insects emerge from the lake, and they form gigantic swarms over the land. These swarms sometimes look like smoke over the land. Here is another picture within a swarm. It's almost hard to see anything because the density of the midges is so thick. Some of these midges also fall to the surface of the lake, and at times the lake is covered in dead midge carcasses. What are the implications of these major insect hatches? Well, they're pretty important. This image here is taken from space. It's a Landsat image. Brighter red indicates higher productivity. You can see that there is a ring of high terrestrial productivity around the perimeter of the lake, representing the enrichment effect of the midge carcasses that fall to land. Other thing that has been found is that the inputs of these midges to the terrestrial ecosystem has had a major effect on the functioning of the terrestrial food webs and predator-prey interactions. So here is a pretty neat example of how benthic productivity from a lake can have transformative effects on the surrounding terrestrial landscape. So now finally I'll summarize things. We've talked about the different habitats in lakes. We've talked about the organisms, at least some of them, that live in benthic habitats in lakes. We've talked about their diversity. We've also discussed their role in ecosystems and how they have been a neglected part of lakes, but can be very important in energy flow. And finally, we talked about an example of where they have an important role in habitat linkages in the landscape, and the productivity of benthic habitats can actually fuel terrestrial food webs. I want to say one last thing about why we should care about these habitats. We've learned that littoral zones and nearshore habitats host a tremendous diversity of organisms and are very important for ecosystem processes in lakes. If we go visit an undeveloped lake, say somewhere in Wisconsin, generally it'll look like this. You'll see fallen trees, you'll see vegetation growing down to the edge of the lake, and you'll see a tremendous diversity or mosaic of subhabitats in the nearshore littoral zone. But increasingly, the shore areas of lakes look more like this. People put their homes adjacent to the lakes, and they craft the lakeshore to look like a suburban neighborhood the way that they want it. And what this does is it destroys that littoral habitat and homogenizes the habitat so that that diversity is lost. I want to emphasize the importance of this lake edge. This is the part of the lake where the terrestrial and the aquatic environments meet, and it's home to the littoral zone, which we've learned is a mosaic of habitats and a hotspot diversity. So in many cases, preserving lakes really comes down to simply preserving the edge of the lake, these areas that are most sensitive to lakeshore residential development. I hope you learned some things about benthic habitats and have a greater appreciation for benthos and all things benthic.